All right, now the overall design of the book of Judges, it was heavily edited by their Deuteronomic historians who went through Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, reorganizing the material in accordance with the ideas in the book of Deuteronomy that was discovered in the temple around 620 BC. And it had a tremendous impact on the Jews and the people in Jerusalem. There was a major reform of the religion. And remember, the 3 points are absolute monotheism in Deuteronomy, which is a collection of speeches by Moses. Absolute monotheism, which is obvious to us today. All the people we know, if they worship God at all, worship one God, I would think, unless we know Hindus, and they have thousands, but they don't live around here. But in those days, it was an enormously new idea to have one God. And the Israelites were surrounded by people who worshipped all kinds of nature gods. There was a God for the river, and the God for the mountain, and the God for the sky, and the God for the earth, God for everything. The personifications of nature. So in order to get people to focus on one invisible spiritual power, which most people just couldn't conceive of, the book of Deuteronomy is giving all kinds of threats and blessings. That's the second point. The first point is absolute monotheism, only one God. Second point, if you obey God and worship only Him, He will bless you. The blessings a farmer would want, because they were farmers. Good weather, good crops, etc. If you turn from God and worship the nature gods, you are going to get curses from God. So God responds depending on how you treat Him. And that's the stick they hold over people's head. Well, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings had already been put together in loose form, but they were rewritten to prove the 3 points. Whenever anyone in these books strays from worshiping the one God, terrible things happen to them. Whenever anyone sets up local shrines rather than worship at the official central shrine where God has chosen to dwell, they get punished. And in accordance with this consequentialist theory of retribution, the if-then theology, I call it. If you do good, then you'll get good. If you do bad, you'll get bad. All right. Given that, the Deuteronomic historians went to the collection of Judges stories that had already been collected. And it's very much like a Western movie, I said, where you jump from town to town to show how the good sheriff of Abilene or Tombstone or Kansas City cleans up the town and fights off the savage Indians. Here, the people who have to be fought off are the pagans who are trying to reconquer what the Israelites had conquered under Joshua. This is the next generation. And those people, now they want to conquer what the Israelites have. So it's a constant struggle going up to the headlines in today's paper, the same thing. People fighting over this tiny little corner of the world. Because it's very strategic. It's where Asia and Africa and Europe come together. Everyone wants it. So we've been jumping around to various places. We saw the judge Deborah and the others before her. And now we're going to go to Gideon, chapter 6. And the geographical references show us where this is. This is in the north of Israel. After Deborah had defeated the local pagans, it says in chapter 5, verse 31 at the end, and the land had rest for 40 years. So Deborah won with her boyfriend Barak, who he led the army against Sisera in the name of Deborah the judge. She won 40 years of peace for the people. But afterwards, of course, they backslid, which they always do, which we always do. We know perfectly well this story. We say to God, yeah, you did this for us and that for us, but what have you done for us lately? Chapter 6. It's always the same Deuteronomic structure. Point 1, the people do evil. Point 2, God punishes them by letting the Midianites, in this case, rule them. Point 3, they cry out to the Lord when they realize their sin. Point 4, he sends a judge to liberate them. Judge, just read tribal chief. And then point 5, the tribal chief leads the Israelite army against the enemy, or the local tribal army against the enemy, and then the land has rest from war. Always the same 5 or 6 points. The Deuteronomist, if nothing else, is consistent and he repeats the same thing, pattern over and over. The people of Israel did what was evil on the side of the Lord, chapter 6. And what was that? They worshipped other gods. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. There's a logic to that. If you're going to worship the local Midianite pagan gods, well, I might as well give you into the hand of Midian. You're there already spiritually, so now you're there politically and militarily. And God always does that. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve left him psychologically and spiritually by their choosing to eat of the forbidden tree. But then he threw them out. But in a sense, they'd already thrown themselves out, you see. So he ratifies physically what the people choose spiritually. And the hand of Midian prevailed over Israel. Of course, because Israel has sinned. Not because Midian has a stronger army. That's never the explanation in the Bible. That may be a hidden text somewhere underneath the surface, but the point being made is you obey God, you win. You disobey God, you lose. The hand of Midian prevailed over Israel, and because of Midian, the people of Israel made for themselves dens which are in the mountains and caves and strongholds. So they're driven up out of the flatlands into the mountains. And the Israelites who had conquered this land under Joshua now are fugitives in their own land, living in caves. Whenever the Israelites put in seed, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east, the pagans, would come up and attack them, so they couldn't even do their farming. They would snatch away the crops. And they would encamp against them and destroy the produce of the land as far as the neighborhood of Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, and no sheep or ox or ass. They steal everything. For they would come up with their cattle and their tents. So apparently, the enemy are cattle people. The Israelites are sheepmen. You've seen enough movies with Gary Cooper, the sheepmen against the cattlemen. Now, if you want to destroy sheep country, you just bring in an enormous herd of cattle and tramples everything. And that's what the Midianites did.
Or if you want to do the Warisuchi, you send in sheep and they...
That's correct, but that takes longer. For they would come up with their cattle and their tents, coming like locusts for number. Sounds like somebody who saw it, and he said, it's like a locust plague. Both they and their camels could not be counted, so that they wasted the land as they came in. And Israel was brought very low because of Midian. Well, really because of their own sin, and God uses Midian to punish them. And the people of Israel cried for help to the Lord. Let me just point out, as I have before, that people sometimes ask me when I speak in churches, how is it that all these ancient peoples disappeared and only the Jews remain, when every one of these ancient people conquered the Jews at one point or another? Well, you might say God promised, and so the remnant of Israel will always be here. That's theological interpretation. I believe that. But you can explain it in terms of a doctrine that the Jews came up with. If you were an Assyrian and the Babylonians conquered you, you might begin to suspect the Babylonian gods are more powerful than yours. And then when the Persians conquered the Babylonians might suspect the same about the Persian gods. And God by God, they disappeared until the Roman gods seemed to dominate, because they conquered the world, except for the Jews. The Jews developed a unique theory, the theory of tough love, that if we win in the battle against our enemies, it means we've been righteous, good Jews, following the law of God, and so he's rewarding us. And if we lose, it doesn't mean that the other gods of the other peoples are stronger, because those gods don't exist. The Jews are the only monotheists. They concluded, therefore, that our God, the God of Israel, is leading the army of the enemy against us to punish us for being less than the ideal Israelites we should be. The way a daddy or mommy, if the kid continues to run into the traffic and play, he might actually be driven to slap his kid to get him to, don't do that, you're going to die. And God slapped Israel around frequently. And the result is they interpreted their sorrows as the judgments of a just God, and pulled themselves together and did better until they backslid again, which all human beings do, and then they went through the same thing over and over again. But it's that theory that's so brilliant, that there are times when the God of Israel is fighting against Israel, not to destroy Israel, but to discipline them. Great idea. And probably in large measure responsible for the seemingly eternal quality of the Jewish people. The people of Israel cried for help to the Lord in the verse 6. So, point 1, they did evil. Point 2, he gave them over to the Midianites. Point 3, they realized their sin and cried to God. When the people of Israel cried to the Lord on account of the Midianites, the Lord sent a prophet. Now, we see there are 3 episodes in the book of Judges in which God explains what he's doing. First, he sent an angel. We saw that 2 weeks ago. Now he sends a prophet, and then later at the end of the book, he himself will appear and speak to people and say, this is why you're having trouble. Verse 8, the Lord sent a prophet to the people of Israel, and the prophet said to them, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I led you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of bondage. Didn't I? Didn't I do that wonderful thing for you? And I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you and gave you their land. That's the people of Canaan that the Israelites conquered. But I did it, said God. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall pay no reverence to the gods of the Amorites, meaning the Canaanites, in whose land you dwell. This is what I ask of you. I've sustained you, I've given you your life, I've given you this land of milk and honey, but what I require of you is loyalty. You shall pay no reverence to these gods, but you have not given heed to my voice. That's why you're now in the hands of the Midianites. It's no mystery. I told you it would happen, and it did. Verse 11.
Does he name the prophet?
No, this is an anonymous prophet. Anonymous prophet. Usually the prophets are named, but not in this case. The point is it's God's voice that matters, not who delivered it. Verse 11. So with that introduction, God having explained himself, now we're going to see the story of Gideon, which is dropped in to this larger structure. Because God has to send a judge or a tribal chief to lead them. The point is, it's God doing it. And God is always saying, it's not the tribal chief, it's not the judge, it's me. Remember that. And here, he is going to pick the most unlikely person that you could think of to lead the Israelite, at least his tribe, the tribe of Gideon. None of these judges are national judges, except possibly for Samuel at the end of this period. But all the others are just local tribal leaders. Now, remember, there's no national government. God is their king, so you just have elders running the local tribes, and when there's a crisis, God picks somebody, puts his spirit in him. That's what the operative idea is. God's spirit enters him. He becomes a mighty man of valor. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak at Ophrah, verse 11, which belongs to Joash, the Abizarite. These were a local clan. His son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Now this may indicate that Gideon is a total idiot. You don't get very far beating out wheat in a winepress. Now we're not familiar with either of those things, but they're things for beating out wheat, they're machines, and they're machines for pressing wine. He's got them all mixed up. It's like saying today he was trying to drive a washing machine down the street. He put wheels on it and it didn't work very well. Or it may not mean he's an idiot. It may mean that the wine presses, the wheat machines are in the hands of the Midianites, so he has to use a wine press. And if it isn't efficient, that's not his fault. He's doing the best he can. But I would go with the first explanation, because later on he's going to do such stupid things that the point is that God chose the town halfwit to lead his people against the enemy, to show if the Israelites can win being led by this idiot, well, it can't be him, it must be God. That's the point. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him. So much to Gideon's amazement, an angel appears to him. And this is how he hails him. The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. And Gideon says, who, me? And then he says, excuse me, sir. If the Lord is with us, then why is all this befallen us? Why are the Midianites terrorizing us? If God is with us. He challenges the angel, as many Old Testament characters do. And where are all his wonderful deeds which our fathers recounted to us, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? I heard about that. I was raised on that in Sunday school. But I haven't seen any of it. Throughout my lifetime, the Midianites have been running this place. But now the Lord has cast us off and given us into the hand of Midian. So he's challenging the angel's statement that the Lord is with Israel. Verse 14. And the Lord turned to him. The Lord suddenly. So it's not clear, is this an angel or is this God himself? And you know, it may make a difference to us, but in those days, an angel represents the outreach of God into the world. When it says the Spirit or the angel, it means God active in the world, interacting with human beings. So 1 minute it's an angel, next minute it's God himself. Verse 14. The Lord turned to him and said, go in this might of yours and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. Do I not send you? In other words, I do send you. And you are a mighty man, because I said you are. Not just a nincompoop. You are a mighty man because the Spirit of God is going to come into you and make you mighty. Verse 15. And he said to him, pray, Lord, how can I deliver Israel? Behold, my family is the weakest in the tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. Everybody knows it. They laugh at me. You're choosing me? And the Lord said to him, foolish man, I will be with you. Don't you want to remember when Moses said, I can't go to Pharaoh, I'm slow of speech. And God said, who makes man's mouth? And who makes him eloquent? Are you kidding? Or when Jesus' disciples said, how can we stand before councils and kings? He said, the Holy Spirit will give you the gift of eloquence when you need it. So how small is man without God, and how infinitely great he is with God. If we just open ourselves up to that influx, inbreaking of the Spirit. And the Lord said to him, but I will be with you, and you shall smite the Midianites as if they were one man, a whole army, as if you were knocking down one man. And Gideon responds, well, he doesn't have much faith. He's used to being pushed around by the other people. He said to him, Gideon did, verse 17, if now I have found favor with thee, show me a sign that it is thou who speakest with me. So I need a sign before you ask me to go out and lead an army against the Midianites. I don't know what the heck I'm doing. You expect me to do that? Show me a sign and then I'll believe. And
It's not a good thing to ask for, a sign.
well, this time he gets it. When they ask Jesus for a sign, he gets rather annoyed.
Yeah.
But here, God delivers. Verse 18. But I'm going to give you a gift. On the off chance that you're really an angel, I'm going to bring you a present. Verse 18. Do not depart from here, I pray thee, until I come to thee and bring out my present and set it before thee. And God said, I will stay till you return. So Gideon went into his house and prepared a kid, a young goat, and unleavened cakes from an ephah of flour. He overdoes it. An ephah is a large amount of flour and not necessary for one angel. The angel doesn't eat anyway. He doesn't know that. The meat he put in a basket. The broth he put in a pot. He makes a whole meal and brought them to the Lord under the oak and presented it to them. By the way, under an oak, this oak is a pagan symbol, a phallic image, which was used in nature worship. So we're going to learn why he's encamped at this pagan shrine. Gideon is supposed to believe in the true God. And we'll find out his father is a pagan priest. This gets very interesting. All right, so he brings a whole meal, meat and bread and soup, and presents it to the Lord or the angel, whoever this is. Verse 20, and now we're back to calling it an angel. And the angel of God said to him, he must have said to himself, doesn't he know angels don't eat? But all right, he's trying to be nice. Take the meat and the unleavened cakes and put them on this rock. Well, that's highly symbolic. Tzur Yisrael, Rock of Israel, Rock of Ages. God is always, frequently compared to a rock because it's the most nearly eternal thing we have in nature, in the creation. Put them on this rock, use it as an altar, and pour the broth over them. So you put the bread and the meat on the rock, and you soak it down with soup. And he did so. And then the angel of the Lord reached out the tip of his shepherd's staff and touched the meat and the unleavened cakes, and there sprang up fire from the rock. The thing is consumed, the soaking wet mass like consumed. And the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. Other translations say he went up in the flame. Well, that's pretty. He takes the gift that Gideon brings and turns it into the sign that Gideon asked for. Interesting. Verse 22. Then Gideon perceived that it was, after all, the angel of the Lord. And Gideon said, alas. Why does he say alas? He should say hooray. But no, the tradition was if you look upon God, you're going to die. He's now afraid. Alas, O Lord God, for now I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. Are you going to strike me dead? And now the Lord appears again and said to him, peace be to you. Do not fear. You shall not die. Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, the Lord brings peace. And to this day it still stands at Ophrah. So when this was written, that altar still stood there, which belongs to the tribe of the Abizrites. All right, so this story explains the call of Gideon to be a great military leader when he'd been a total schmo until then, and how this altar was built. That was very important to people in those days. You had altars around the country. How is it that this former pagan site with this pagan oak tree, which is a very frequent symbol at pagan shrines, because it's god of fertility and all, became an Israelite altar? How was it built? That's the first account of the call of Gideon and the building of this famous altar. Now there's a totally different second story. So there are two traditions here of how Gideon was called by God and how this altar was built. We've seen the first story. Verse 25. Another account. It's like, how did David come to the attention of King Saul? We're going to see that in a few weeks. It says he killed Goliath. And Saul says, that's a guy I want on my team. But another story says Saul was going crazy. He was a manic depressive. And they called for David, who was a fine harpsman, to give music therapy to King Saul. Two completely different stories. So all we know is David did come to the attention of King Saul and ended up replacing him as king. But we don't know how, so there are two traditions. They put them both in. Same thing here. That night the Lord said to him, whoever knew this story, I don't think knew the first one. They've just been put together. God appears to him and he says something very curious. Take your father's bull. Now there are a lot of bulls around there because they're being offered by his father, who is a pagan priest, which we'll see in a minute. The second bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal. Baal was the nature god of Canaan, which your father has. So the father is a priest of Baal. He's an Israelite, but he's an apostate, a Jack Israelite. He's worshiping Baal, the local nature god, the worst thing you can do to the Deuteronomist. So the son of a pagan priest is going to become a Jewish hero. Tear down the altar of Baal, which your father has built, and cut down the Asherah, that's the oak tree, the sacred oak, which is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of the stronghold here. That was a common thing. The Israelites would build altars to the true God where pagan shrines had been. Same thing with Christians. Vatican Hill was a shrine, I believe, to the god Tammuz before it became the center of the Christian, at least the Catholic Christian world. You choose a sacred place and you build your new religion on it. Yes, sir.
The Romans did that in Jerusalem when they conquered it, renamed it Aelia Capitolina.
Yes.
Jupiter was built on the Temple Mount.
Right,
the Church of the Nativity.
Exactly. And now you have the Dome of the Rock. So the Muslims then built on the same spot.
Well, the same thing happened in Bethlehem. They built churches.
Absolutely.
there.
Right. All right. And build an altar to the Lord your God on the top of the stronghold here with stones laid in due order. Then take the second bull. I don't know why it makes a point of saying it's not the best bull, but the second best bull. I don't understand it. Maybe to consider the fact it wasn't his, it belonged to his father, and you didn't want to infuriate his father by taking the best bull. I don't know. Never was able to understand that. Take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering to the true God with the wood of the Asherah. Take the wood of this pagan oak and make it an offering to the true God, which you shall cut down. So he's cutting down a sacred tree and smashing down a sacred altar. He's going to have to answer for that. So Gideon took 10 men. Took 10 men of his servants. His father's an important priest, lots of servants. And did as the Lord had told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night. So nobody knows. But they're going to wake up in the morning and they're going to see what happened. When the men of the town, verse 28, rose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal had been broken down, and the oak tree, the Asherah, beside it was cut down. These are sacred things to these people. And the second bull was offered upon the altar which had been built. And they said to one another, who has done this thing, this blasphemous thing? These may be Israelites, but they're totally apostates. They're worshiping Baal. Which shows why God put them into the hands of the Midianites. And after they had made search and inquired, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, our priest, has done this. Then the men of the town said to Joash, bring out your son that he may die. For he has pulled down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah beside it. Now Joash is a pagan, not a good guy, but he's a father. And he is going to start trying to defend his son. He doesn't want his son killed. Verse 31, Joash said to this mob that is lusting for his son's blood, will you contend for Baal? He's trying to throw logic at them. Or will you defend his cause? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning, because if you're fighting for Baal and you think he's the true God, then you're saying he can't fight for himself. You're really insulting him. Let Baal contend for himself. He's God, that's what we believe, then he'll take care of my son. But if you do it, it means you don't really have strength, have confidence in Baal's power. It's very convoluted logic, but he's trying to save his son's life. And the writer tells us in verse 32, therefore, on that day, Gideon became known as Jerubbaal, which was his official name. That is to say, let Baal contend. Now, the whole story is a way of explaining how Gideon is called as a great leader, how an altar to God was put up in the place of a pagan altar, and how Gideon, a Jewish hero, got the name Jerubbaal. Let Baal contend. It sounds like his name is honoring Baal. Well, it was. The reason his name was Jerubbaal probably is his father was a priest of Baal and he named his kid in honor of the God he believed in. This story is not really credible to me. It twists everything around to show that he was called Jerubbaal not to honor Baal, but to show that if Baal is really a god, he can take care of himself. And of course he didn't. He needed a mob to do it, therefore he's not really God. It's like the story of how Moses got his name. The Pharaoh's daughter finds him in the bulrushes, and she says, I will call his name Moshe, because I mashad him out of the water. Mashah is to draw out. She couldn't have said that, because Mashah and Moshe, that's Hebrew. The Pharaoh's daughter didn't speak Hebrew. She called his name Moses because Moses is a very common Egyptian pagan name. And if he's raised in the palace of Pharaoh, he's raised as an Egyptian, and that's why she called his name Moses. But of course, that's embarrassing to the Jews that their greatest prophet and hero has a pagan name. So they have to invent this story about being drawn out of the water in order to explain the name. My Hebrew name, every Jew has a Hebrew name, and when we're called up for prayers in the synagogue, they don't call Michael Kogan, they say Mordechai ben Nehemiah HaKohen. Nehemiah is my father's name, Nehemiah, my name is Mordechai. Marduk-hai, it's a Marduk name. Marduk was the head god of the pantheon of Babylonia. How did I, a Jewish kid, get a name that honors Marduk? Because the Jews lived in Babylonia for 50 years of exile, and that's probably where they picked up Babylonian names. You know, you pick up Mike Wallace, reporter with CBS, Jewish guy, has his son Chris Wallace. Chris is the most Christian name you can imagine. But he's an American, and it's in the neighborhood, and so you pick up American names. So things are not so carefully orchestrated where Israelites always get Israelite names. But if we have one that isn't Israelite, then you have to explain it. Today nobody cares about names, but for the Jews it's very important. You know, when a Jewish child is born, you don't just go to the baby book and pick a name you like. You have to go to the family history, and you name the child after a deceased ancestor, the father, mother of the parents, something like that, to keep the name alive in Israel. All right, so names are very important. So he's named Jerubbaal not to honor Baal, but because he tore down Baal's altar. Very strange. So, two accounts of how he's called. Now, he's been called by God. Verse 33, the war story. Then all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east came together, an alliance of pagan tribes to conquer Gideon's tribe. And crossing the Jordan, they encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord took possession of Gideon. That's the key. In every one of these stories, a judge who is a rather unlikely guy becomes a great hero when the Spirit enters him. The Spirit of God is the operative actor in the whole Bible. In the very beginning, it says, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved over the face of the water. Then it says God breathed into Adam the breath of life, the Spirit of life. Spirit, constantly coming into this world from God. And every one of the judges and every one of the prophets has the Spirit of God come into him. It's not his own talent that makes him a great military leader, as the judges had to be. It's not his own talent that makes a prophet a great spokesman for God, as the prophets had to be. The eloquence and the military